In 1067, a year after the Battle of Hastings in England had been won using bows and arrows, the Chinese emperor was so concerned about the proliferation of the new weapons technology of gunpowder that he banned the export of the chief ingredients of gunpowder, sulphur and saltpeter, to the barbarians of the north. And he was right to be concerned, because over the century following his action, we see a true industrialization of warfare in China. So that 100 years after his action, we have got 11 large workshops in China with 40,000 people engaged in the manufacture of gunpowder weapons alone, and the state arsenals were turning out weapons at the rate of something like 3 million items a year. As a result of that, the armies of the Sung dynasty were certainly better equipped than any others in the world. It's not surprising, therefore, that the Mongols left their conquest of China till the very last, and that they took so long to accomplish it.
Still the puzzle then, the country that invented gunpowder weapons, finally they never sort of developed them and in the way that they did in Europe. Perhaps you could explain what went on and contrast the two.
There's a strong contrast between the development of gunpowder weapons in China and in Europe. They're developed in China first, and they certainly become effective weapons of war very quickly. It's all rubbish about the Chinese just using gunpowder for fireworks. On the other hand, when from the 13th century onwards these weapons find their way to Europe, they find their way into a rather undeveloped little world with all sorts of small states engaged in fierce military competition. There's therefore, in Darwinian terms, huge evolutionary pressure on gunpowder weapons, and they improve very rapidly because European states are prepared to put as much resources as are necessary into getting the drop on their neighbours, and guns help them to do that. Also, within European states, the kings, who up to that time found it pretty hard often to keep their feudal lords under control, find that gunpowder weapons are a resource that is just great for increasing the power of the centralised state and knocking feudal lords off their high horses and out of their stone castles, something which, say, the King of France in particular found very useful. If we look at the effects of this rapid pressure for the development of technology, we find that countries are competing with one another to find new techniques for casting guns, and England, for instance, develops an export industry in cast iron guns, which it does for a while much better than any other country. This might be one of those examples where the pressure of war technology helps to advance technology in general, and obviously it might be a factor in early pressure in Europe for building up the kind of metal skills that ultimately were to be of great use during the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
In 1839 onwards, the supreme historic irony befalls China at the time of the Opium Wars between Britain and China, because China sees its own technology of gunpowder weapons coming back in the form of the powerful guns on Royal Navy ships, guns which are much better than any which the Chinese had got in their shore batteries. And that is, of course, simply because Chinese technology has spent some time in another part of the world, torn by war, certainly, but one in which there's been much greater pressure to develop these weapons. So China finds itself truly hoist by its own petard.
But China, I mean, the wars did continue in China, didn't they? I mean, it wasn't an entirely peaceful state for 5 centuries, was it? I mean, so I mean, that's...
The difference in warfare in China and in the West is that quite frequently we're not dealing with the same sort of thing that we get in Europe, where we have one kingdom fighting another. We're dealing with a case of rebellion inside and sometimes invasion from outside, but not usually long periods of competition between states on more or less equal terms. And that's the sort of thing that seems to have driven the development of weapons technology in Europe very fast. Such things as, say, the effect of the Napoleonic Wars, where you had the great powers of Britain and France certainly developing all their naval and weapons technology very fast. That was not the kind of experience of warfare in East Asia during those centuries.
Perhaps you could clear up for me, Christopher, about the significance of the Great Wall in isolating China.
The Great Wall is one of the great symbols of China for Westerners and for Chinese alike, but it's often greatly misinterpreted. Certainly, the Great Wall was there as an earthwork for a while when the Chinese Empire was founded in the 3rd century BC. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, linked together various earlier fortifications to make this great linear defense work. But for most of Chinese history, the Great Wall is never mentioned as a significant barrier, and it had no military significance. It's not until we get up into the Ming dynasty, when their frontier policy begins to fail from the 15th century onwards, that they begin to resort to the frankly desperate expedient of simply building large walls with bricks and stone in an attempt to keep the nomadic peoples of, say, the Ordos area and other bits of Central Asia under control. Up to then, they'd done much better by a combination of trade, occasional punitive raids, and various other clever barbarian management techniques that were much more effective and much cheaper than building a large wall that people can, after all, very often simply find ways through.